Alrighty, up next we have Keenan Rivers from Michigan Tech to present on some hardwood silviculture research. Everyone can sit down and shut up and we will listen to what Keenan has to say.
You need to just arrow key through the presentation. Thank you, sir.
Hey, thank you very much. So I'm Keenan Rivers. I'm a PhD candidate in the silviculture lab at Michigan Tech, advised by Dr. Julia Burton. My talk today is called Linking Functional Diversity and Carbon Dynamics in Northern Hardwood Silviculture. A quick introduction to the team. My committee members are Crystal Kern from the Northern Research Station in Rhinelander, Carrie Woods of Bennington College and the Huron Mountain Wildlife Foundation, and Stephen Volker, also of Michigan Tech. My funding comes from the Huron Mountain Wildlife Foundation, the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station, and USDA McIntyre Stennis. So getting into silviculture and carbon in northern hardwoods, there's been a historic focus on yield, which can kind of directly translate to carbon sequestration, right? So foresters have been doing this a long time before we even had this kind of storage sequestration language in place by controlling residual density, structure, spacing, and species composition. Recently, storage or carbon storage has become more of a focus. So kind of a trade-off between sequestration and storage makes managing for both of these things, so maintaining yield and also storing a lot of carbon, kind of at odds with each other. But is that necessarily true? So to get at that, we're measuring functional traits within these forests. So what is a functional trait? A characteristic measurable at the individual level. So these are leaf or wood traits, for example, leaf dry matter content, or how much carbon is in the leaves, how much mass there is per surface area, the nutrient level in the leaves, the wood density, sapwood area, crown size, or shape. These can all get at how the trees are using the resources around them and how they compete with each other. And we can look at how these traits are correlated with one another at tree scale, species scale, community scale to get at their ecological strategies. And that can tell us how they're competing with one another. So one of those kind of common trait correlations is the leaf economic spectrum, where leaves of tree species or plant species kind of fall in this gradient from more acquisitive strategies where they're trying to capture as much carbon as possible in a short amount of time, kind of that live fast, die young strategy where they have low leaf mass per area, low leaf dry matter content, but are highly nutritious. An example of that would be striped maple, which is, yeah, Marquette is kind of within the range of it. Huron Mountains for sure. That's kind of a wide leaf that has low carbon and high nutrients. It's really trying to capture the understory light environment, the low light environment, and kind of take advantage of that as much as possible. On the flip side, we had more conservative strategies, such as locally, like Eastern hemlock is a very conservative species. So it has high mass per area for each leaf, high dry matter content, but generally lower nutrients than some of these other broadleaf species. So this can get at their general strategies. There's kind of that live fast, die young acquisitive strategy versus the more conservative strategy where they're looking to live longer, maybe grow slower. So we can take these functional traits and get functional diversity. So that is basically how different in character the species within a community are from one another. So we have two functional diversity metrics here, functional divergence and functional evenness. Functional divergence is how different the average trait values are from each other within a stand. And yeah, so the x-axis here is the trait value range. So the left might be more acquisitive traits, the right might be more conservative traits, and the density is the distribution of those traits by biomass within a community. So the blue line would be high functional divergence, where things are very different from each other within the stand, versus low, where it's kind of that might be one species or a collection of species that are very similar to one another. Similar for functional evenness, where you have that kind of low functional evenness, where it might be one species or a few species that are very similar to one another, versus high functional evenness, where it's very evenly distributed between the functional characteristics. And how does that relate to productivity? Well, higher functional diversity can lead to complementarity effects. So the decreased overlap of niche, so those traits are farther apart from each other. Those tree species are not competing as much with each other, so that decreased competition can lead to increased productivity. And that's what we call complementarity. On the flip side, there's the selection effects or competitive exclusion mass ratio. And that basically means that where we find an abundance of really well-suited traits, we're going to find higher productivity. So that's kind of the right trees getting to the right place. And they'll see basically less diversity will mean greater biomass or carbon storage or sequestration. So how do we relate functional traits to carbon in silviculture? Well, silviculture, like I mentioned before, can directly affect carbon dynamics. So we can remove basal area from a stand. We can change the species composition that way, but so change the carbon dynamics that way. But we can also change the species composition and thus alter the trait variability, which in turn can affect functional diversity or the trait identity or the average traits within the stand, which can then affect carbon dynamics down the line. So silviculture can kind of directly affect carbon dynamics through removing biomass or changing residual densities, things like that. But it can also affect carbon dynamics through changing species composition. And this can happen naturally through disturbance, competition, nutrients, or moisture differences between communities or over time. But silviculture does have a role in managed stands of altering that. So where are we studying this? We're looking at the Duke's Experimental Forest, which is kind of its own thing all the way to the west of the Hiawatha. And there's two really old silvicultural trials there. So the first one was established in 1926, the partial cutting study. And it was established to kind of take a look at these, at the time, newer partial cutting methods to see which could produce the best saw logs and the most volume over time. So they compared diameter limits, single tree selection, group selections, and clear cuts. It's a great study. It's been kind of maintained over the years and measured through over time, but it's not replicated, so there's only a single one of each of those treatments. Building off of the partial cutting study, they established on the same forest the old growth stocking levels and cutting cycle study. So that was a little less than 30 years later. And they took the results of the partial cutting study and they were able to design the split block design of different cutting levels. So 50, 70, and 90 residual square root residual basal area and cutting cycle of 5, 10, and 15 years. So there's 3 levels of stocking level, 3 levels of cutting cycle, and then they replicated each of those treatments 3 times. For our research, we focused just on the year 10 cutting cycle because of a lapse in the treatment. So that experiment ran from when it was established in 1952 until sometime in the 70s, and then the treatments were stopped for a period of time, and they were re-entered again, I think most recently in 2009. But because the cutting cycle wasn't necessarily maintained over that period, we just chose to focus on kind of that middle of the road one, like thinking that the variability between them would be kind of lost over the years. We also have old growth reference to work with. So there's the research natural area also at the Duke's Experimental Forest, and that's a 100-hectare parcel of hemlock hardwood forest with also a significant beech component that has had no history of logging or no significant history of logging. So an old growth remnant or maintained research old growth. And we also have some plots at the Huron Mountain Club, which were established in, I think I have the date on the next slide, by tech professor Bordeaux and rediscovered by my collaborator Kerry Woods, and he's been measuring them since the 70s, I think, no, the 80s. So that's a 2,500-hectare preserve with no history of logging. Also hemlock hardwood, but no beech at the Huron Mountain Club. It kind of stops, around Marquette, but is moving west. So the inventory data, we're very blessed to have a lot of inventory data from all of these sites, and they've been measured and maintained by others, and we're happy to pick up the torch with some of our remeasurements in 2023 and 2024. So the Duke's Research Natural Area has 129 upland 5th acre plots. There's other lowland plots that haven't necessarily been maintained, but we focus on the 129 upland plots, and those have been measured 8 times since 1977, most recently by us in 2023. Here in Mountain Club, there's 19 of those 5th acre Bordeaux plots that Kerry Woods has been measuring up until most recently when we measured them in 2024. And those have been measured 10 times since 1962. The partial cutting study does not have 5th acre plots. It has square 1 to 3 acre sampling plots within the treatment levels. And those were measured 8 times in the kind of initial run of the experiment. So until 1966. And then they were picked up again by the Forest Service in the 2000s and remeasured most recently by us in 2023. The replicated study, which is just the single tree selection, that has between 12 and 16 5th acre plots in each of the treatments. And those were measured 5 times at the initial run of that experiment, and again in 2002, and again in 2023. Dubiously marked, and finding them again 20 years later was a chore for sure. So we also collected traits. Like I mentioned, traits are just leaf and wood characteristics that we can get. And so we wanted to develop models for each of the abundant species on the forest. So wherever we had our inventory data, we could see, okay, most of the basal areas in these handful of species, or a couple of species, are maybe not that much basal area, but they're very abundant and we'd like to sample them. So we collected canopy leaves as well as sub-canopy leaves from each of the canopy trees using a shotgun. So that's basically just aim up into the canopy where you want to get the leaves from, and the BBs will strike a small twig or something, essentially exploding the small twig and dropping your leaves and twig sample down into the forest floor. Can be tricky because if you're shooting a small section of maple leaves and it falls into the maple regen, you have to hunt them down, but we managed. So we sampled that along a shade gradient because the traits can change a lot by shade. So for example, sugar maple is fairly plastic in that sense, where leaves in the full sun are going to be woodier, they're going to be less nutritious potentially, versus leaves in the shade are going to be that kind of more flimsy, kind of lighter material. So we wanted to capture that shade gradient. We also captured size gradient, measuring different canopy tree sizes as well as seedlings and saplings. Once we collect the samples, we take them back to the lab. We get size, weight, leaf tissue, nutrients, twig density. We collected increment cores from the canopy trees to get wood density, sapwood area. We collected canopy diameters, things like that. So we tried to extract as many traits as we could from a subsample of trees in each of the treatments to create this model of trait variability for each species. So once we have our trait data and our inventory data, we can kind of scale everything up to the community level or the treatment level for our silvicultural trials. So we can get carbon storage, and this is only above ground carbon storage, not below ground or soil carbon. So this is just based on published equations for biomass from diameter, and then we can get carbon percentages also from published equations. For sequestration, we just looked at the differences between our measurement periods and the rate for those, the difference between the periods. And for our functional traits and our functional diversity metrics, we use trait probability density functions, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying for each of our species, we're able to create a model of how the traits are distributed. And I'll show an example of this. And then we can combine those weighted by our inventory data to create a model of how traits are distributed for each of our communities, or even at fine scale like the plot level. So here's an example of those trait probability densities for each species. This is from the Huron Mountain Club. Our bottom axis there is that acquisitive to conservative scale. This is from an ordination, but basically it's unitless at the bottom there, just represents a gradient from more acquisitive, so that kind of low mass, high nutrient leaves. So the highest would be basswood here, to our more conservative species, which is that kind of high mass, less nutritious, and eastern hemlock is our most conservative. And you can see that some species have more variability in traits, like sugar maple or eastern hemlock, and some species specifically understory species only, like striped maple or ironwood, where they're not really in the canopy that much. They have a lot less variability in traits. That's those like sharp spikes compared to the distributions there. And then we can take this data and kind of smush it together based on the distribution of trees that we get from our inventory data to create kind of plot level models of trait variability. So these are our Huron Mountain Club plots. And I just wanted to point out how they kind of change through time. So this is 1962 and 2024. And we can see this one plot, 7091, has changed in conditions. So it's not necessarily changed in its trait identity, but more in the distribution of those traits. So it's earlier it was maybe concentrated toward the negative values, maybe mapley, and then we can see it kind of flattened out and moved a little bit to the right. So that to me says that it got some more conservative traits, maybe yellow birch, maybe hemlock has moved in there. And that's how it's changed over time. You can see these plots, many of them change minimally over time. So the old growth forest here is very stable, but things like small scale wind disturbance can also change the trait identity over time. And it's interesting to see that some of them, I don't have them highlighted on here, but some of them shift almost entirely. If you take a look at 7096, which is the middle one on the left there, it initially has a peak to the left side. That's maybe more acquisitive traits, maybe it went from maple dominated to 2024, where it kind of shifted more to the right side, maybe it became hemlock dominated and the maples fell out of the stand. All right, so a lot of this is going to be preliminary, but we do have some early results specifically from the Huron Mountains site. And I can show those. So the community types there are distributed based on the relative abundance of hemlock or sugar maple. This is how we sorted them, or initially Kerry Woods sorted these for his a publication from 2000 or something like that. But there's just a gradient of basically sugar maple dominated, 92% sugar maple, that's by basal area, to hemlock dominated, with 82% hemlock, and then kind of a mixed condition. This burned condition is also hemlock dominated, but there's evidence of a fire from 1830, and it has a very different stand characteristic from the other hemlock dominated. The plots that are in this kind of 82% dominant, the true hemlock dominated, have huge diameter trees, really, really high basal area. It's super cool area. That burned area, although it's kind of compositionally similar, has a lot smaller average diameter. There's a lot of mortality going on. It's kind of, it is a much younger stand, despite being burned in 1830, which is like a long time ago, but not for Eastern hemlock. That like, it still appears as a very young stand. Here's a picture of that. So this is that kind of burned condition. We have a lot of snags. We have low diameters of hemlock generally. There's not much understory development. So like, to me, if this wasn't hemlock, I'd be like, okay, this is kind of like a younger stand. I've seen ash stands look like that, things like that. So not that kind of old, huge hemlock forest that we think about, but it still is technically within the old growth forest here, the reserve. So no history of logging, just that fire occurred around 1830. So we can look at how average traits, or the average kind of acquisitive to conservative trait values, change over time. And we see that the two hemlock stands, which are the top, they have the most conservative traits. That makes sense. Hemlock's quite conservative. And we have our lowest is a pure sugar maple, the red line. The mixed stand is still pretty sugar maple-y, but a good combination of both. So striking about this to me, and something we didn't necessarily expect, is how uniform it is. Like, it really does not change over time. The kind of trait identity, or the identity of these stands on average, is pretty uniform from 1962 to 2024, which is cool. And so we were thinking that possibly functional diversity would follow the same pattern, but functional diversity actually does change quite a bit over time. So responding to more subtle differences in the abundance of species, we can see that although the hemlock stands are kind of staying the same in functional divergence and evenness, might be becoming slightly less even over time. The mixed stand in particular has become more functionally diverse over time since 1962. And the sugar maple stand has kind of a slight increase, but kind of a weirder pattern there. Well, it's interesting how functional identity, not really changing very much, right? But we do have kind of responses in the diversity. We can also look at carbon storage over time from our inventory data, and we see that all of the stands, despite they're not really right next to each other, they do follow similar patterns, so they're responding to the same things, climate, weather events, such as and things like that. And we see that the two pure stands, so the almost fully hemlock and the almost fully sugar maple, are the highest carbon storage, and our kind of more diverse stands are slightly less stored carbon. Sequestration, kind of a mess there, but that's just the difference between the sampling periods. And it's hard to pick out any patterns specifically from that, but we did check. So early models, so we can take this functional diversity data over time and take our carbon storage data over time and produce a model. We also attempted a carbon sequestration model, but it did not turn out well. Essentially, we were not able to model that. We were able to model carbon storage. So we were able to find, this is for just functional divergence, that for the most part, the sugar maple dominated, the mix and the burned had neutral or no response to functional diversity, to carbon storage from functional diversity. Hemlock dominated stands do have a response to functional diversity, and it is dependent on the average trait values within the stand. This model came out kind of complicated, but it's okay. It's not too bad. So we do have, where the stand gets more mapley, right, more negative on that acquisitive to conservative, we see more of a response to functional diversity in the hemlock dominated stand. So we do have a positive response suggesting potentially complementarity. When in the other stands, the sugar maple dominated, we don't really see that complementarity effects, implying more selection effects dominate, where it's more that right tree, the right place, where sugar maple in this region grows very well. That makes a lot of sense to me. Hemlock, there are some reasons, and I'll get to this later, as to why I think that hemlock is responding in this way, and the hemlock dominated stands. Functional evenness, we have a very similar thing going on where only the hemlock is responding positively to this functional diversity. The other community types have kind of neutral or no response. So the minimal positive effects of diversity suggest that selection effects are kind of prevailing over complementarity effects for most of our stand conditions or community types. But we do have positive diversity effects in the hemlock specifically, a case for complementarity. And kind of why this might be occurring is probably related to the characteristics of hemlock. So hemlock is one of the best species for growing space efficiency. So they can grow these stands where it's kind of tied with sugar maple as far as carbon storage, the two community types, but a hemlock tree of the same diameter is going to store way less carbon than a sugar maple tree of the same diameter. And the reason they're able to kind of maintain similar levels of carbon storage is because hemlock can grow much denser than sugar maple. They're very efficient with smaller crown diameters. They can grow very large. And so in those stands where we might see sugar maple trees popping up, which again would store much more carbon for the same diameter that a hemlock tree would, there might not necessarily be outcompeted by the surrounding hemlocks, and the surrounding hemlocks might not be bothered by that sugar maple or hardwood species popping up. All right, on to more silviculture, looking at what we'd expect to find from the Duke's experimental forest. And I don't have any actual number results from there yet, but just thinking about what we expect to find. So we'd be looking at a potential gradient of residual density of the treatments, and the opposite direction would be functional diversity. So we'd expect that functional diversity would be highest under intermediate disturbance levels. And in the case of our kind of dominant silvicultural methods, intermediate disturbance is a pretty heavy cut compared to what we typically would do, right? So single tree selection is modeling that kind of individual tree mortality or small groups of tree mortality. So kind of that low levels of disturbance, and that we wouldn't expect high functional diversity or high species diversity from those low levels of disturbance. And we would expect higher diversity from kind of an intermediate disturbance. So it's going to peak at intermediate disturbance and then go down again at high disturbance. So right now I have functional diversity question mark because these are just ranked by residual density. But the actual ranking of functional diversity is probably going to be a lot different. For example, the old growth forest, which is dominated by those single tree mortalities, but as well as kind of long rotation intermediate disturbance, like 200-year intermediate blowdowns that blow down, a few acres. That is allowing that higher species diversity, functional diversity, and we're not necessarily emulating that with many of our management strategies here, particularly the ones that we find at the Duke's Experimental Forest. So within these stands, we want to see, does diversity lead to more productivity? From our initial results from the Huron Mountain Club, we might think not, because these, again, are all hardwood dominated. There's not much hemlock in the managed stands. Yeah, basically none. So in those hardwood dominated conditions, we might expect minimal effects of functional diversity, but we'd be interested to see if it makes up for some of that trade-off between sequestration and storage. So if we're cutting pretty heavily to sequester more carbon, are we making up for that by the increased diversity? So are we able to sequester even more? Another thing to look out for at the Dukes is the presence of American beech. So American beech not present at the Huron Mountain Club, but does have kind of interesting traits, similar to hemlock kind of in that it's very shade tolerant, capable of growing in the understory, has different traits from the maples, basswood, yellow birches. And so we might expect some form of diversity effect from the presence of American beech, kind of taking advantage of those low light conditions in the understory. But there's implications of beech bark disease, which is present on the stand now. And what is that going to mean when those larger beech start falling out of the stands? Thickets start to develop, things like that. So that's another thing to think about. Also, beech leaf disease, if that comes in and kills all the beech, and then that's kind of a moot point. So could go either way. Another thing we've done, so this summer I went out with one of these LiDAR scanners and I collected terrestrial LiDAR scans from all of these plots to get at canopy structural complexity, which has another type of diversity. So structural diversity can also be tied to productivity, particularly in younger stands. So my undergraduate advisor, I worked in his lab, he had a publication in 2015 from the Duke's RNA looking at if there was any response to functional diversity in forest productivity. And they found that in the old, very stable forest, there was kind of minimal effects, and they were highly dependent on scale. So at fine scales, they could find these diversity productivity, structural diversity productivity relationships, but at broad scales or kind of the scale of the RNA or the community types within the RNA, they didn't really find much evidence for that. We'd also want to look at the canopy structural complexity within the managed stands. So management often reduces structural complexity, complexity in general, but specifically canopy structural complexity. And we want to see if that in turn, if canopy structural complexity, the variability of that within the managed stands will lead to more carbon storage or sequestration. There's also a potential interaction between traits in these structural diversity metrics where the right traits are able to get to the right place because the canopies are so complex. So you may need a combination of trait diversity and structural complexity to get these kind of over-yielding, higher productivity situations. So the next steps for me, finalize trait data set from the Huron Mountains. So I have to essentially run the same analysis at the Dukes that I did at the Huron Mountain Club, incorporate some more traits. We're still working in the lab, crunching the numbers, include additional traits. So the results I showed you before had no wood traits in them. It's going to be interesting because our leaf traits are all correlated with one another, but not necessarily the wood traits. So that might throw another wrench in our models, and to incorporate the structural diversity. Thanks to all our lab and field technicians, Shauna, Garrett, Annie, Clara, Zoe, Mark, Olivia, Sarah, Kaylee, and Adam. Thank you. Questions?
Got time for one. If not, you can find them at dinner. He'll be around. Okay. Thank you. All right, next we've got Rebecca Barnard from SAPI talking about EUDR regulations. She's going to be coming at us from Zoom. She's in Wisconsin. So we're going to get her pulled up and we're going to find out what the latest is on that stuff. Hang tight.
Hey, Rebecca, I just promoted you to panelist. I couldn't make you a co-presenter. Are you able to share now? Can you share your screen?
Good afternoon, Mike. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you share your screen?
Let me try. Okay, let me know when you can see it.
Something is happening. All right. It is, we can see your screen. Do a sound check. Say a sentence or two.
Hello, everyone. This is Rebecca Bernard coming to you from Green Bay, Wisconsin with SAPI North America and SAF.
You sound great. Rock and roll.
Awesome. All right. I'm not going to turn the camera on if that's okay. I don't want to mess up what we've got working here. I can do that at the end for Q&A. All right. Well, first off, thank you to Mike and Sarah and the organizers for allowing this to be Zoom. Again, my apologies about that. Last year, it was totally my fault in terms of a scheduling mix-up. This year, there's been a lot of family health crises, and so I am trying my best to sort of avoid any mass groups and illness to hopefully reduce the chance of giving any illnesses to my dad and uncle, both of which have cancer and have had numerous surgeries. So my hope is to be there with you at some point again in the future, and hopefully not be talking about EUDR, which seems to be the story of my life. So I'm going to breeze through this. Obviously, I won't be able to see your reactions. If there's questions, feel free to raise those at the end if there's time, or of course you can reach out to me also offline. So EUDR, if you have not heard of it, you are blessed. My apologies, you're going to know more than you wanted to know in the next 30 minutes. EUDR stands for European Union Deforestation Regulation. So, all right, first I need to read a disclaimer. Bear with me. So this is SAPI's interpretation of the information that we have at the moment. We are working to try to digest and understand this new regulation. This is in no way official guidance or legal advice from SAPI to you. This is simply our understanding of a continuously changing situation, and we are doing our best to help share what we know and what we think. But again, this is in no way legal advice or official guidance, and it's very important that you understand that. So, all right, EUDR, let's cover the basics. I spoke about this last year and the year before, so I'm not going to get too much in depth here. Hopefully, you're somewhat familiar. If you're not, the basics of EUDR is that it prohibits all sources of deforestation. But terminology is very important in this regulation. Deforestation is not what you and I might think it is as foresters. Deforestation from the regulator's standpoint is only conversion to agriculture, period. They are not worried about conversion to mining or infrastructure or green energy. They are only concerned about conversion to agriculture. However, it could be human caused, or it could be a result of natural disturbance that then leads that land to be converted into agriculture. So both man-made and natural disturbance events are included in what they are trying to prohibit within the EU market. They are also trying to prohibit degradation. This term, again, is uniquely defined, somewhat ambiguously. I'm going to talk about that later. It seems to be generating a lot of confusion, I think, unnecessarily. So why are they focused on agriculture? Agriculture is the predominant reason that we are losing forest land around the world. Not in North America, but around the world, it is 90% of the reason we are losing forest land. So the EU is trying to basically look at the biggest culprit, and that is agriculture. EUDR is not just focused on our industry. It includes cattle, cocoa, coffee, oil, rubber, soy, and finally wood. Packaging, if it is only used to transport the item, is excluded. But a lot of companies that make packaging like SAPI, our packaging is sold into the EU as the item itself, and then it's later on used for something else. But if it is a brown Amazon paper box that is just simply containing something else, then that does not need to comply. Textiles, pharmaceuticals, bamboo, and recycled products do not need to comply. So there's a lot more information on scope in Annex 1. I'm not going to talk too much more about the scope of this from here on out. What are the due diligence obligations of the operator and trader? Now, those are uniquely defined terminologies. Operator and traders have to be entities that are based in the EU. So I'm going to venture to bet that almost all of the, or maybe all of the entities in the room there, including SAPI North America, are not an operator because we are not based in the EU. We are based in North America. So it is going to be our downstream customers who are the operators or the traders. But they have to exercise due diligence to prove that the product is deforestation and degradation free and that it's been produced legally. They have to upload a due diligence statement. I'm going to talk about what that is. And they have to communicate certain information downstream. For all of us that have spent the majority of our professional lives dealing with certification, SFI, FSC, PEFC, unfortunately, certified products are not assumed to be compliant. And there is no tolerance for any insignificant amount of unknown fiber or non-compliant fiber. And there are strict penalties based into this regulation, a minimum 4% fine up to banning the entity from placing product on the EU market. So let's break it down a little bit further. This is a slide I came up with on my own. I think it kind of helps. Again, these terms are not what we might think as scientists. You have to put yourself in the role of a regulator. So the first thing they're trying to stop is illegal sources. Sounds simple, but if you look at the bottom right, you'll see their definition of legality has a lot of things in it that may or may not be required by current law, such as FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. So that's something to take a look at, but I'm going to not talk too much about legality. Let's look at deforestation. There are two types of deforestation that they are trying to stop. The first is conversion of a natural forest to agriculture. The second is a conversion of a plantation to agriculture. Now, we might locally talk about red pine plantations, white pine plantations, white spruce plantations, whatever. That does not really meet the definition of plantation in this regulation. They are talking about, southern hemisphere eucalyptus, radius pine plantation, but nonetheless, natural forests and plantations cannot be converted to agriculture. And then if you look at degradation, there are three types of degradation. And again, all of these underlined words are specifically defined in the regulation. So you cannot convert. Again, that's the key word, convert. We're not talking about changing the age rotation, changing the percent of species distribution. No, we're talking about conversion, okay? So you cannot convert a natural forest to a plantation or a natural forest to other wooded land. Other wooded land is very sparsely wooded and we don't really have that situation here, okay? So that's item number one under degradation. Item number two is you cannot convert a primary forest to a plantation or other wooded land. I'm going to talk about what a primary forest is later. And you cannot convert a primary forest into a planted forest. Most of what we call plantations are actually planted forests, okay? So you can convert a natural forest to a planted forest. You just cannot convert a natural forest to a plantation. So you have to keep those terms different in your head because they are different in the regulation. So before I get back into some of the details on degradation in primary forests, let's take another step back. What is the status of this? Many of you were following this last year, perhaps, to know that it took the EU government agencies 3 months to finally move forward on their 12-month delay. That did finally get passed December 18th last year, and so we have been operating under a 12-month delay. This law was supposed to take effect December 30th, 2024. Then they voted on December 18th last year to delay it to December 30th, 2025. Since then, there's been a lot of additional developments. There's been a lot of pushback from EU prime ministers, even though their own politicians voted for this. There's been pushback from other countries all around the world, including the US. There's been pushback from Canada. There's been pushback from other commodity groups in the agricultural space. And they have also finally finished their country risk benchmarking. So in the regulation, the EU was required to define the risk of each country. They used a contractor to do this, and they could classify each country under one of three risk categories: low risk, standard risk, high risk. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. So they have completed that. They also completed a first round of consultation on amending the scope of this regulation. I do not know the status of that amendment. That's kind of fallen silent. And they've also issued 3 different guidance documents: an FAQ, a guidance document, and a supply chain guide. All of those came out this spring. Drafts were out last year. So I'm going to talk about some of that. So lots of movement this year during this delay. What's happened recently? Well, on August 21st, 2025, the Trump administration and the White House issued a joint statement on the US and EU framework for an agreement on reciprocal, fair, and balanced trade. This got a lot of attention and everyone was breathing a sigh of relief. But if you actually read the text, it really doesn't say very much. So the actual impact or whatever specific changes are being negotiated are unknown. And until more details become known, there's really nothing that is going to change in this regulation. So that at least is promising. The Biden administration did not engage in pushback on this. The Trump administration has been. What else has happened? Well, on September 23rd, the EU Commissioner for Environment, now there's a lot of commissioners. I'm learning more about EU politics than I ever wanted to know. But the EU Commissioner for the Environment, her name is Rosewall, proposed another 12-month delay. So that would delay it till December 30th, 2026. And there's a press release. There's a lot of different stuff on the website you can read, on the web that you can read about this. The rationale was problems with their IT system. Now, anyone working towards compliance could have told them 2 years ago they had problems with their IT system and that any IT system was going to crash under the amount of data that they are requiring. So why they're talking about it now, I don't know. The commissioner is denying that this has anything to do with the U.S. Trade agreement or any other negotiations with other countries. They're also not willing to go on record as to whether they're going to change anything else in the regulation. But this is very important. This is not official yet. This has to be voted on and approved by the EU Council, the EU Parliament, and the EU Commission. Right now, this is just one commissioner who's written a letter proposing the delay. So last year, it took them 3 months to get this all voted on. It failed several times. I do not have any idea if this will move forward quickly or not. I think there's a potential that this could move forward in the next 2 months. I think there's a potential this could actually not get done until the new year, and they're going to try to implement it in the meantime. I really do not know, but it is not official yet, and that's important. A lot of people are sort of drinking champagne and celebrating this delay. In the meantime, though, we are in what they call the transition window. The transition window is the time period between these 2 dates. There's the entry into force date, which was June 29th, 2023. And then there's the entry into application date. The reason that that time period is important is because any products that are put on the EU market during that time period do not need to comply. So all of our competitors in Europe are placing product on the market right now, and it does not need to comply. The fiber that they're harvesting does not need to comply because they're purchasing it and using it and selling a product on the market. All of the fiber that anyone in North America or South America or Asia, any of the fiber that we're harvesting and any of the products we're producing and selling domestically are not yet on the market. And that means that if they do not get imported into Europe until after this date, December 30th, 2025, then they need to comply. So our compliance window is much longer than the folks in Europe. They really don't have to start complying until currently December 31st, 2025. By the way, I think someone forgot there's 31 days in December. I don't know why they just didn't make it December 31, but who knows? All right, so what is this due diligence statement? This is outlined in Annex 2, the last page of the regulation. Again, remember, the operator needs to do this. The operator is the first EU entity that is importing the product and placing it on the market. So again, I'm going to venture to bet that that is not any of us in the room, including SAPI North America. We are not an operator because we are not based in Europe. So it's going to be one of our customers that has to do this. So what do they need to do? Well, they need to supply their own name, their own address, and their own EU registration number. They already know that. They already have to do that for custom import requirements. They also have to have the commodity code, the commodity name, the scientific name of all the species, and the quantity of the product. They already know that. They already need to provide that information, so that's fine. They also need to report the countries of production. Again, they already know that. That's already commonly communicated. As an example, this is what SAPI's documents look like that we provide for the purposes of custom import-export. It includes the commodity code, the product name, the quantity, the country of origin, the species, et cetera, et cetera. So everyone's documents look a little bit differently, but some people call these wood origin reports. These are very, very commonly exchanged documents, and they're actually required under certification. So those first few data points are not the concern. So what is the concern? It's this last item, the geolocation and harvest date. Nothing up until now, including chain of custody certification, has ever required geolocation of all plots of land where the commodity was sourced or produced. And if you don't remember from last year, if you're harvesting less than 10 acres, you can use a GPS point. If you're harvesting more than 10 acres, you have to have a shapefile, a polygon. Almost all of our harvest areas around this part of the world are more than 10 acres. So we're dealing with complex data, not just GPS points. And you might say, well, what is a plot of land? A plot of land is defined in the regulation as a single real estate property, meaning you cannot draw a circle around the state of Michigan or the state of Wisconsin and say, here you go, this is my wood basket. That's what we've all done up until now. We've all defined our wood baskets. We've all assessed our wood baskets for controlled wood risks and SFI risks and FECV and biodiversity. This is not looking at a wood basket assessment. This is asking you to assess and identify every single geolocation. And if that single real estate property has different conditions on it, such as a forest and a farm field, you need to split those into two different polygons because the forest and the farm field have a very different level of risk of deforestation and degradation. The forest could still be deforested. The farm field already was. So that's why that gets really, really difficult. Also, the date or time range of production. Obviously, this is not like harvesting corn. Our harvests sometimes take weeks, months, sometimes years. And so a specific harvest date for each truck that comes across your scale is also not feasible. So this is the challenge for our industry, but also for many other industries. This is also a challenge for some of the agricultural commodities and anything where there's basically more than a couple sources as part of your product. What does this data look like? Many of you would be familiar with this, but this is a slide I use with our customers. You know, our customers do not have foresters on staff. They do not have GIS technology. They have no understanding of this. They're going to get a file that looks like this. They're not going to know what to do with this. They have no ability to do anything useful with this data. And so, you know, that poses a big risk and a big question about how are they going to do due diligence over a set of data that they can't even process and can't make any sense of. So what are some other differences for the EU versus the rest of the world? Well, first of all, in the EU, every time that there is a harvest between a landowner and a logger, there will be a due diligence statement submitted for that one landowner, and that will create what they're calling a reference number. From there on out, the shapefile never needs to be provided again. Only the reference number will need to be passed on down the supply chain. And in the EU, when you're interacting with this IT system, you can hide the geolocation data to protect your sources. Very important. However, outside of the EU, you cannot upload your harvest site and create a reference number because your landowner is not in Europe. I'm venturing to bet you're not harvesting directly from lands in Europe. Maybe you're getting pulp, but you're not, getting probably timber. So for landowners in the US and Canada, when you as a logger or a mill buy that, you cannot upload that one individual shapefile to create a reference number. So you're going to have to collect that as well as, all the other sources, and then provide all of that in an aggregated way to your customers, and then they're going to pass it on, et cetera. It's only when that final product reaches Europe that that reference number will be created. So we're going to have to exchange all this sensitive data that in Europe, they're going to be able to protect. It's also a very different level of complexity. In Europe, they literally can track this with a spreadsheet of reference numbers. That's not going to be the case, for all of us. So very, very different set of complexities, as well as the ability to protect sensitive data. Additionally, I believe that there should and could be a case made about free trade barriers with this. There's a couple other things that are quite different, the way that they've written this regulation. So I'm calling this the backdating problem. Remember that first date I told you, June 29th, 2023. For our industry, we have long supply chains, we have complex supply chains, we have long inventory time periods, many, many times anyway. And it often is many months after a product is produced until it may finally reach Europe. Sometimes it's longer than that, could be a year, 2 or 3. And so the wood that we were harvesting already in 2023 and 2024 needs to comply because our product won't get to Europe till later. But in Europe, they don't have this backdating problem. So that's problem number one. And then moving forward, the way they've written this is that if you're in Europe, as soon as that timber is placed on the market, you're responsible to make sure there's been no deforestation. For our industry, as we all know, this is somewhat silly because as a logger or a mill, you're not responsible for the deforestation. That happens later. When you harvest the timber, it was a forest, you're expecting it to still be a forest later. You can have some conversation with the landowner, what are their intentions, etc. But none of us can see into the future. We don't have a crystal ball. So when you harvest the timber, you're expecting it to be a forest. And in Europe, they're going to expect you to do that due diligence in between that harvesting and the product being on the market, which is almost simultaneous. For us, again, it could be many years after harvest until the time that product reaches Europe. So we have a backdating problem and we have a future compliance problem. I know this sounds technical, but this is a technical regulation and it's going to get complex, I fear, if they actually implement it the way it's written. Okay, so let's talk about a couple other things, and then I do want to talk more about degradation as well. So there's various articles in this regulation. Information gathering, Article 9, is required for everyone. That's where the geolocation data requirement comes from. Information gathering and geolocation does not change based on your risk categorization. That's very important. Some people are still thinking that if you're low risk, you don't need to provide geolocation data. That is not correct. Articles 10, which is risk assessment, and Article 11, risk mitigation, those are contingent upon risk. So if you have low risk, you do not need to do that. If you have high risk or standard risk, you do. So I'll get a little bit more detailed. In May, they published this country risk benchmarking. I'm just showing you an example of the 2-page document on the right. They only identified 4 countries in the entire world as high risk: Belarus, North Korea, Myanmar, and Russia. There are a variety of standard risk countries, including Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Paraguay, just to name a few. And there are 140 some countries that are low risk, including Canada and the US. So Canada and the US does not need to apply Articles 10 or 11. But again, geolocation requirement is in Article 9. So Article 10, if you need to do it, if you are sourcing from any of those standard risk countries, I'm going to guess none of us are sourcing from the high risk countries, then you need to do an assessment at a detailed level of each geolocation plot of land. You need to assess your supply chain complexity. By the way, the EU considers anything more than 2 suppliers as a complex supply chain. I'm going to guess all of us in the room have complex supply chains. And, only if you have low risk of mixing from any other country can you skip Article 11. One of the problems with Article 9, in addition to the geolocation data, is Item H. No one really knows how they're going to enforce this. Item H says that you need to have conclusive and verifiable information of compliance with relevant legislation. That sounds easy, but if we have to do this for every plot of land, that is no longer practical or likely even possible. So that's kind of an outlier right now. No one really knows how they're going to enforce Article 9H. All right, let's talk about degradation for a moment. I know time is going quickly here. Degradation has its own definition. It's important to understand this. As I mentioned before, it is talking about conversion. We as foresters probably think that degradation is looking at quality, like maybe the quality of your biodiversity habitat has gone down, or the quality of your maple beech forest has declined. No, they're not talking about quality. They're talking about conversion, structural conversion. And as I mentioned before, it's conversion of a primary forest into something else, or conversion of a naturally regenerating forest into something else. So that's important. So what is a primary forest? I'm going to propose that we don't have any. And this actually is not my idea. It was an idea from a Forest Service colleague a few years ago. I have to admit, I do not follow the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but apparently the UN Framework on Climate Change sanctioned this report in 2018 that looked at a lot of countries all around the world. I'm just showing you 2 at the moment, and it identified managed versus unmanaged lands. Okay, so you can see, based on the coloring, in the United States, the lower 48 was all managed lands. I know the foresters in the room, including myself, say, well, no, of course there's unmanaged lands. Remember, we're not splitters here. The regulators were lumpers. We're trying to do this high level to meet the law, not to be scientifically accurate on every acre of land. In Canada, the southern half of Canada was identified as managed. If you look at the definition of primary forest, I think that this UN report basically confirms that we don't have any, because the definition of primary forest says that there is no evidence of anthropomorphic activity at any point in the past. No evidence of anthropomorphic activity. That includes First Nations and Native Americans, who heavily utilize these forests. Different ways than now, but they still use these forests. So I think we can make a strong case that we do not have primary forests. And if you don't have them, you can't convert away from them, right? Hopefully that logic makes sense to everyone. And again, as I mentioned, conversion of a naturally regenerating forest into a plantation, we do not meet the definition of plantations. We have planted forests, but that is okay. All right, a couple other things. I am not going to attempt to explain this all. If you need to comply, you need to closely read the FAQ and the guidance document. That's 140 some pages in totality. I'm just showing you a couple things that are going to be quite interesting and problematic to see how they play out. For example, if you have a plot of land, as is shown here on the top, and there's some illegal activity on some part of that property, even if it's unrelated to where you sourced your timber from, then that timber no longer qualifies because there was illegal activity somewhere on the plot of land. I'm going to venture to bet that we probably don't, all ask the landowner everything they're doing on every part of their property. We're concerned about the area that we're harvesting and the area that has the forest management plan. So that's going to get interesting. Also, there's good and bad in that they are trying to focus on the causal link between harvesting and degradation. That's great. I'm totally behind that. However, again, sometimes we don't know when we're harvesting what the landowner is going to choose to do after the harvest. So how are you going to prove that? That's going to get interesting. Again, you can see lots of color coding. That's the point here, is that as you closely read the guidance document and the FAQ, things sometimes start to get less clear because they're really, in some cases, contradicting themselves. So I'm going to move on from that. I would just say, if you can't sleep at night, try to read those documents, and then you definitely won't sleep at night because you'll probably be as frustrated as I am. So what has SAPI done? I'm not authorized to speak about our specific geospatial solution anymore, which we have implemented, but we have certainly communicated to our suppliers and to our customers. We have customer-facing documents that we've sent out. Again, they do not give legal advice to anyone, including our customers. And this is to help our customers be prepared, because we know many of our customers are not following this regulation the way that we are. We also have revised our procurement policies last year. We've provided those. Some of you may have received those, through supply chain channels. So we've revised our policies to include a mention of EUDR and to define it, because again, we know some of our suppliers are not following EU politics the way that we have been lately. And so our requirement is that if our supplier knows or suspects that there will be conversion after the harvest, they cannot bring us that timber. We, again, do not expect our suppliers to be able to predict the future. So we are asking them to go off of what they know, what they see, and what they, believe to be true based on their conversations with those landowners. And lastly, and I think this is really important, I think, and you know, again, I'm telling this not only to my own company, but to folks like you guys and also our customers, we cannot let the message or the story of this regulation be that it has saved the world, that this regulation is now requiring due diligence. We as an industry have been doing due diligence for 60 years or more. And certainly for the last 30, it's been documented, well documented under certification, Lacey Act, things like that. This regulation and these regulators are not the saviors of the forests, in my opinion. In fact, I think this regulation is going to do a lot of harm, not good. So we need to tell the story that we as foresters and as the forestry profession have been concerned about deforestation and due diligence and responsible sourcing for decades. And we have evidence to prove that. Many of our companies have been triple certified or dual certified for decades. So please, when you're talking to people, don't let the message be that, now because of EUDR, we're doing due diligence. That will be very unfortunate if we let that become the message, because the message will become reality. And so what I keep telling even folks in my own company is that the problem with this regulation is not that we as foresters don't understand it. We're very intelligent. We understand what they're trying to require. The problem is that what they're requiring is not possible to, at least it's not possible to be perfect with it and to be exact. And it's certainly not practical, and it's not going to accomplish the goal. So that's the problem with this regulation. It's not that we don't understand it. And I think that we are not getting this message out there very much. We're arguing amongst ourselves what a primary forest is, what a plantation is, what's degradation. There's been a lot of conversation around that. Instead of us all stepping back and saying, wait a minute, guys, we as an industry have been leading the way in sustainability and responsible harvesting. And let's not let that message be lost in the problems with this regulation. So with that, I am happy to open it up for questions. And if I can see how to turn my camera on, I will.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for the work you do, because I can't keep track of that on my own. We can take 2 questions. Got our mics going around.
So my question is, where would FSC fall in all this? Because companies like yours pay FSC piles of cash every year. And are they just sitting on their hands? Because I would be extremely upset if I were paying that freight and they're just watching, because I thought that was supposed to be our shield, globally from stuff like this.
Yeah, great question. I think, frankly, this regulation, the certification systems should be, and I think they are concerned that in this regulation, the regulators place almost no value on certified products. And I think this is a failing of the certification world, and all of us included, not just FSC, PEFC, and SFI. So in the regulation, they're very clear that certified products are not assumed to be compliant, and you still need to provide geolocation data and all the other due diligence. The certification systems, all of them, PEFC, FSC, and SFI, have all created optional EUDR modules that as a certificate holder, you can sign up for. That will require more fees, more auditing time, more auditing costs. And at the end of the day, even if you do that, the EU regulators still will not consider it compliant. So that really undermines the value of going through more work, more audit risk, and more redundant data, plus the auditing fees. It's not cheap to go through audits. So at the moment, I have not seen much uptake. Unfortunately, even though the systems are trying to react and trying to support their certificate holders, based on the way the regulation is written, it's not going to help the operators.
All right, one more. Thank you.
Just one comment. I'm from the old school. I grew up as a kid during World War II. And the only thing I can say, and maybe this is insulting to the Europeans, if the United States didn't enter World War II, I think we would have known the answer. And all I saw, that was just a bunch of BS. That's it.
I only heard part of it. I heard the last part that this is a bunch of BS, and unofficially, I agree with you.
All right. Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was great.
Yeah.
We appreciate you.
Thank you for not shooting the messenger. Again, I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'll hope to be there with you all next year. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so we do not have a state representative here, but we didn't want to let you guys go without talking about some more policy. So we're gonna have Jim Malloy come up and lead a policy discussion to close us out for the day.
Yeah, I hope it's a discussion.
Yeah, Rebecca, that was a good lead-in because Michigan SAF is working on a deforestation policy and Jim's about to start talking about other state and national policy we're watching here.
Nice, great. Thanks, Mike.
All right, Jim, take it away. Come up here and get the microphone.
Slide, I get what I'm talking about. So who loves policy? Anybody?
I do.
You don't, Ben. But policy does impact what we do. And state policy especially impacts the things that we have to deal with.
Consumers want to see you.
I don't want to, they don't want to see me.
They want to see you.
Here, how's that? So there's a couple bills out there right now that have been introduced that we've been watching at different levels. And I'd really like to see SAF become more active in policy discussions, especially at the state level, especially with Michigan SAF. Right now, there's a bill out there, 4851, that was introduced in the House that limits the amount of land that the state can own. Now, we already had the state go through different instances of how much land the DNR can own. This bill, 4851, says that if the state owns more than 50% of the land base within different governmental subdivisions, counties, townships, cities, villages, school districts, that they would be required to dispose of anything over that 50% margin. So that includes two counties that the state identified, which are Luce County and Roscommon County, are both more than 50% state owned. But how many townships do you work in where more than half the land is owned by the state? And if that has to be sold, who does it sold to? And what are the outcomes of that? 4694 and 4695 allow for the creation of a public entity, a public authority to manage forest land. It's basically a group of bills put together for a transfer of ownership between the Nature Conservancy and the state on a pile of land up in the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula. But what it does is it's creating a new group which would own this and giving them the rights over that land and how they would be able to manage it, and if they choose to sell it or parcelize it, things like that. That ties within the Municipal Forest Act, right, Mike? What was LUC? What did you say that was? Land use change. Right, so we had a position statement or a letter of support against this last year that we did when Glen Lake Schools were talking about taking their school forest and converting that, giving it to developers for the purpose of building what they were terming affordable housing for teachers. There's bills out there to open up the Commercial Forest Act. That would include this TNC conversion, because the 13,000 acres that are up in the Keweenaw Peninsula are currently under the Commercial Forest Act, and they're asking for a carve out so when they sell it to the state, they do not have to pay the withdrawal penalty. How many other CFA landowners would like to not pay the withdrawal penalty if they choose to sell their land to others? So there's another bill out there that has kind of died, which would also increase the taxes on the CFA lands for the purpose of generating money for a forest product development fund. That stems from, if everybody remembers, when Billerud got their big $200 million investment when they were going to do all these improvements and convert the Escanaba mill over to containerboard. Well, then when that didn't happen, that money got pulled away. Different groups, Timmermans was one of the main groups, said, hey, we'd like some of that money to invest in the forest products industry. So then legislators heard that and said, well, they need a fund. Let's create a fund. Hey, let's create that fund by taxing CFA land and putting that money into a fund that then we can put into the into revenues and into a pot of money that was going to be managed by the DNR to encourage development in forest products. In that too, we have, it was a policy, the Michigan Forest Products Council last year received a $250,000 grant to help with logger training. We were talking with the loggers about this after our panel discussion here. So that's called a FIT grant, and it's Travis is part of the committee for that right now, and some other people in this room that have been part of it through the Forest Products Council. So we're looking at having some revenues that can go, or having a training program built through a grant that we've got from the state in last year's budget. Then you have this year's budget. Everybody knows on the federal level, we still don't have a budget. On the state level, we finally got a budget signed yesterday, 6 days past the original due date of when their budget was due. And there's still, I've not seen a full copy of that budget yet. So those are things like on my radar right now, as far as policy that I've been involved in with discussions and keeping an eye out. How many of you had any idea about any of these before the last 5 minutes? Not many, but these can severely impact the work that we do and the work in the lands that we work on. So I'd like to have some kind of a bit of a discussion here, you know, as a group on how do we see ourselves fitting into this landscape of policy making and being informative on policies. We have money that we budgeted this year so that we could have more of a voice and send people to Lansing if we need to give testimony on bills and things in front of different committees, but we haven't done anything with that yet. So when things like this come up, are there people that are interested in doing this? Are there people that have interest in this, a desire, thoughts, something? Other than Ben?
Gonna try to add a little bit of color to what you mentioned. So historically, we've had two mechanisms to be a part of these conversations. One has been sort of like official testimony, educating legislators about the perceived impacts or ramifications of the decision one way or another. That's one way. The other way we've done things is through the development of policy statements, which is led by our policy committee report, where we take a very specific topic, we debate it amongst ourselves, and then we lay out some facts and expectations, and even some recommendations for future policy decisions. Maybe those are the right tools still, maybe we need other tools in the toolbox, but I just kind of, you know, lay of the land. Those are the two tools that we've used thus far to try to engage in this space. They might be appropriate still, or we might need to tweak them. That's what we've done so far.
And I don't want the board to decide this. I want this to be a community decision on how we're going to address things like this. Another one that is not on this list that I forgot about, I got the other day, House Bill 5082, which was introduced by Knus, Preston, Bonac, and Beeson. That bill would heavily impact what we do as foresters as well, because it's related to wetlands. It would empower landowners or lessees to request state assessments of whether land is a wetland. It mandates timelines for assessment and reporting by the department. It would give a binding 3-year effect if the department determines an area is not a wetland. It removes or prohibits fees for those assessments, and it redefines definitions such as continuity, drainage structures, agricultural drains, and such to limit overreach. I mean, that's a new bill that's out there. Does that impact anything everybody does on a daily basis when they're managing across stream crossings or adjacent to wetlands for forest activities and things, and you're filling out Part 301 permits and things? Problem is the legislature likes to find things to do, and we have to make sure what they're finding to do doesn't impact what we're trying to do on the good side of things. Go for it.
But, can they work with municipality who has land, school, forest staff, oftentimes school system, do anyone work with school forest? We need to talk, because I'm very concerned, I was very involved with the Glen Lake situation, Kingsley area schools, and we're in Travis County, it's 900 acres. They are regularly approached by the neighboring golf course to give them land to build more condos. Like, this is an ongoing statewide issue, I believe, at least. And so I wanna know, like, what your interaction with schools are like, who your point people are, so I wanna make sure that they're all aware of how cool the thing they own is and the laws that are surrounding those lands. But because you're already having connections with these spaces, I would love to hear about it, if you don't mind. Sorry, I don't have anything about wetlands there, but.
I guess I'd like to say is that, we should have, you know, that come up before they become law. Only problem I see is SAF is a small organization. We don't have paid staff to present our case in Lansing.
You're right, we don't have lobbyists in Lansing, but we're all part of other groups too that do have those lobbyists too, and we can lean on them and partner with them.
One suggestion would be farm bill. Chairman of the Forestry Advisory Committee. And we take policy recommendations. Typically in August, it goes into their system of voting on resolutions. Comes a resolution, their paid staff works on that, a certain subject comes up. In fact, there's several legislators that have our policy. So, yeah, you need to work with certain organizations. Timberlands would be another one. A lot of groups need to work together a little more than individuals.
And that's something I fully support too. Timbermans and forest products and GLTPA and Farm Bureau and Land Conservancies and MFA and the other ones that I'm forgetting about right now that, I mean, everybody that's in this room is part of multiple organizations, right? And we all have feelers out there and we can use those resources as well, because I've been to meetings with legislators and they're happy to hear about you for the 30 seconds you're in the room with them. And when you leave, it's the next person who's in there with their thing, unless you have some consistent messaging with them, something you can leave them with and keep voicing your constant positions on things so they understand where you're at. And that's why we wanted Bonac here today. He's a new rep from this area who truly doesn't understand our industry. Everybody was here, those of you that were here with Dave Martin back in April, he does not understand our industry. We've spent time with him since then, trying to educate him as to what the forest products industry and what the forestry sector looks like. So he has a better understanding, because if you're going to chair the Natural Resource Committee at the State House, you should have an understanding of what we're doing. And I mean, yeah, we're 150 of us in the room today. We're 350 members, and we know there's probably, I don't know, he's not here, but what's the number of foresters in the state? What's our economic impact? I mean, I know forest products is a 2.6 billion or $22.6 billion. Huh? 26 now? Last it was 22.6. All right, 26 billion Mike wants to use today. $26 billion industry in this state. That's a big mover with not a whole lot of visibility. Yeah.
Writing the latest deforestation policy, why we wrote it the way we did. We're not trying to be activists opposed to a certain measure, trying to be experts, advocates for forests specifically. So we're not necessarily saying we want to take a position for or against politically any of these statements. We just want to make sure that the interests of the forest community are, we're giving them our expert opinion, our expert views on these, doing what we can. You know, a lot of the budget that we're talking about, what we've allocated, it's just so we can, you know, be heard. So people are aware that we exist. There's a lot of politicians, I would imagine, have no idea SAF's the thing. So we're talking about just getting down there and explaining the scientific perspective on these policies, and not so much advocating, you know, if you're one side of the aisle or the other. In that regard, so it is somewhat apolitical.
No, it is 100% because we can have friends on both sides of the aisle with this. And if you think about it, I would venture to say 90% of our constituents are north of US 10 and 90% of the legislators are south of US 10. So most of them don't understand what we're doing. You're right. And it's up to us to educate them on it.
Hi, this is Craig. I'm the former city manager of Ishpeming, and I will tell you from the municipality side how that works. So, you first want to find out how they own land, what they're going to do with the land. Because much of the recreation land comes through our trust fund, which is purchased and then locked, forever. So it's purchased as recreation, must be maintained as recreation. But I will assure you that I've had very limited conversations with foresters about how to improve forest health and how to use it. And so recreation organizations like the IMBA and Common on Trails and different trail associations all want to turn into biking trails or ATV trails. DNR comes by and asks if they can expand active DNR ATV snowmobile trails. And so they're looking at it from the perspective of how they manage recreation, whether it drives any recreation tourism costs and skip dollars in the community. But then you have the large building by Cleveland Cliffs. And so in Ishpeming, there's a sale that is taking place, has taken place, many hundreds of acres, 10,000 acres, point around Ishpeming, where there's mining cave-ins and other things. So cave-in grounds are protected. They have to have fences around. People can't walk around, but there's little pockets for housing. It goes into the housing solution packet, which we already talked about earlier, that the state's trying to generate 10,000 in houses next. I think Marquette has listed that they have 750 coming next year. Like, there's a lot of housing talk, a lot of housing initiatives. They're finding pockets they can. They're demoing lighted structures that we thought marked in early on facades, the land bank here. That was all about demoing old and lighted structures and regenerating housing in those areas. A lot of stuff that's tied directly to housing and recreation, but if you want to engage, there's two places that you should be able to engage, at least Marquette County and NOAA. One is the Municipal Planning Commission, because under the Planning Enabling Act, they have the sole authority to recommend to municipal leaders for decision how to use the land, how to have that land zoned.
But that's
So one includes the zoning municipality, you have the planning commission that's there. But if you want to be more policy centric, influence, join an organization like the Lake Spirit Partnership, who has their Marquette County Ambassador Program, and twice a year they go down to Lansing and lobby on behalf of all of Marquette County for items that are of interest to the county. And so I don't think they have foresters. They have a forestry company that is also multifaceted corporation, which includes housing development, and they're part of the housing development conversation rather than the forestry conversation. So finding a way to inject yourself on Marquette County ambassadors, but I believe other counties like Dickinson and probably also have ambassador programs that are sending these things down, and then interjecting in other areas like that will help you to at least be heard in Lansing if you only want to get to like one or two local voices.
Thank you. Yeah, part of the concern with 94, 95 there is it creates recreational authorities at municipal levels, which then removes that from the zoning capability, and these recreational authorities have the ownership and the rights to manage the land. No, it's not through the planning commission. Not on this bill. Don?
You asked, what possibilities we might have to address some of these quickly emerging issues. We do have a policy committee, but this is an organization of volunteers, which limits the amount of time and availability to work on these sorts of things. However, as I recall from our budget discussion last night, we have plus or minus $60,000 basically that we can work with. One possibility might be to find possibly, a retiree or other individual, and I'm not the one, that might be interested in, say, $10,000 or $15,000 that could fast track policy statements, fast track letters to, congressmen and such, possibly make trips to Lansing on our behalf or find someone in Lansing to do that. So we may want to, use the executive team report, discuss that opportunity and see if that's something viable to address these quickly emerging issues.
And I appreciate that. And I was just, as you said that, it made me think about when Joe was up here earlier and talked about these member initiated proposals. If there's members here that have a feeling on something like this and want to work on that, we already have budget money set aside for that. It's not $15,000, but nobody's spoken for any of it yet. Nothing says you can't apply for $2,500 and say you're going to go advocate or write something up for one of these issues that you feel strongly about. All right, and then we got one last one over there then. Him, we'll do this one, and then we got, is that Jerry? No, it's Keith.
Okay, my question is just regards to Jack Bergman here. I think that was in fall 23. About Farm Bill. I just wondered if anything about it, you know, their relationship.
Jack is a great supporter of the forest products industry as a whole. He was scheduled actually to come up through Grayling, and his one stop at Grayling was going to be at our mill at Weyerhaeuser, just to talk about, you know, to see how we were doing and be part of it. He showed up at their other events and things. He's a US rep, so he's a lot harder to get a hold of, but he has an understanding of what our industry is because his district basically covers where forest products in Michigan are made or grown. And so I'd say that he's a beneficial person to have in our corner on that. It's not on.
Thank you.
There you go.
John Lyle, I work for the Native Conservancy based here in Marquette. I just want to comment on a couple of these different topics that we have up here for discussion and kind of offer up maybe an opportunity to have a larger conversation around some of these things. You know, we were talking earlier about, you know, what can we do as SAF to change creative meetings. And I think one of the things we can do is have conversations either individually about forest policy specifically up here, or have presentations, maybe even offered outside of these forest here meetings, where we can actually have conversations about these policy, because, you know, you can take a list and you all can go home and take a look at it, which I encourage everyone of you to go do or think about how it fits into your work, your lives. But we can also have a conversation and talk through the sort of nuances of what this policy actually is trying to say. And for one, I just want to comment on, you know, up in the QAnon, where we have community forests, and a lot of this policy up here is targeted at as providing an avenue for local public ownership in Keweenaw County. Basically provided with a board of Keweenaw County residents that have been voted upon by specifically Keweenaw County folks. So a board of 5 individuals that will be the governing body for this forest, that was at one point private industrial forest land and is now moving into, public ownership. Just to comment again really briefly, because I know we have others that want to speak on the Commercial Forest Act. So the no penalty for sale to public owner. If we or any other entity were to sell this working forest land to another private forest landowner, there would be no need to remove that working forest land from the Commercial Forest Act. When you sell to a public owner, even if the use remains the same, the intent of this land and the use of this land will remain to be a working forest. The intent of the CF program will be continued. This will remain working forest land. The intent of the commercial, it will, and if it does not, it will revert back to other ownership. And so part of what this is aiming at is actually kind of catching up to a lot of other Midwest states. Wisconsin already has this exemption as part of their commercial forest and managed forest law. So really it's just trying to prevent working forest from not turning into any other use and keeping working forest as working forest. And happy to talk about that more, talk more about that outside of this or.
Hey, Keith.
Yeah, there's one organization in Michigan, the Clearinghouse, natural resource conservation, activities, and that's the Michigan United Conservation Program. 20 years ago, we discussed, strengthening our ties with them. They have a public policy and government affairs management. Then just about every conservation-oriented organization in Michigan is a member of the MUCC. So that is a clearinghouse of voice that we need to strengthen our ties. MUCC always is concerned with timber production, and that's understandable, but some key things, some basic items that we're concerned about, we can find that there'll be supportive of things like retaining working forests and things like this. That's new conservation. Everything cultural land, we're still on removal of forest energy. MUCC has good on our side, SAS side, on a lot of, I don't think we can do it. Connected time.
I agree with you, Keith. And for those that I don't know if you could hear what Keith was saying. He's talking about partnerships and things, and specifically with MUCC. But I think that's something that we lack right now is strong partnerships. I'd like to see more partnerships here with this. Groups like that at our meetings and us at their meetings and having those interactions. And I think it's something that we should all look to build at. I know foresters by nature tend to be a little introverted, but you got to get out. You got to go talk to these people. You have to be involved in these things if you want to be able to make policy changes and just help advance our industry and our professions. So happy to continue these discussions at dinner with everybody. Encourage everybody at dinner. You sat with a group today primarily for the last 8 hours. Find a new group at dinner to sit down and talk with. Mix around, meet some new people. There's a lot of great people in this room that do a lot of great things that you might not even know about right now. So, Mike, you got something?
One last thing.
All right. Mike wants to tell you how to get to dinner.
First of all, I'd like to thank Sarah Kelso and Anna Ellis for putting together this meeting. Well, thank you very much. It is now time for happy hour at the Holiday Inn. And I had a question earlier. There are 2 Holiday Inns in Marquette. You want to go to the right one. You are not going to the Holiday Inn Express up on top of the hill to the west, heading up towards the Walmart. you're going to the main Holiday Inn, which is basically right where Washington Street, dead ends into 41 there. And what is that, a Wendy's right there where you turn in? Where do you turn in right there? Yeah, you turn in at that Wendy's. There is no entrance directly off of 41. You got to turn on that little side street there at Wendy's. So we're going to head over there for happy hour. Should have dinner 6-ish. Make sure you have a plan for your field tour tomorrow morning. We'll have maps and so forth available at happy hour. And thank you everyone for coming to Fall SAF. See you over at Holiday Inn. Thanks everyone on Zoom World. We're done. Thanks everybody for 8 hours on Zoom World. You guys are troopers.